Hi, this is Paul. Peterson's been putting out a lot of material, and so this video isn't really going to be so much a commentary on one video as I'm going to look at a bunch of all of these videos that he's doing, integrate it into some of the Rebel Wisdom stuff, and talk about basically an epistemic storm and principality collapse. And I want to begin with the recent video with Michael Malice. Now, I was kind of excited to see this. I had seen that Michael Malice had been on Michaela's show a couple of times, but I never watched any of them. I've seen his name around. I didn't really know anything about him. I knew that he was somehow associated with anarchism, which to me doesn't excite me at all. I've seen chaos in my life, and I don't recommend it. Deconstruction can be good, but it should always be sort of in the service of reconstruction. So, and in some ways, the conversation didn't. Now I have a clearer picture of what he's about. Probably not a lot of admiration for his position or his take. He's very clever in exposing the blue church, which makes this conversation, following up on the heels of the Bari Weiss conversation, very helpful and interesting, because in some ways Michael Malice and Bari Weiss are in different places. Bari Weiss wants to see the reconstruction of the blue church, and Michael Malice wants to see it all torn down and wants to see it burn. Because so in that way, Peterson, I think, is far closer to Bari Weiss, because he also is in many ways he's in a professor, a professing member of the Blue Church, but he does have much more of a reformist mentality, but he's not ready to burn the university down. And what's interesting about him and Malice is that, and this I think showed some of Malice's, I found him rather sophomoric, because, well, all university professors are complicit in the, when he says all cooperation is tyranny, it's like, okay, you can't live by that, and you can't live by that code. That is always going to be a parasitic take. It's always going to be a parasitic code. It goes back to Jonathan Peugeot's, you're never going to build anything on all of these parasitic frameworks, because what will happen, I just finished a conversation with Paul Anleitner, which I'll post probably after this video, if I post this video on Thursday. All parasitic takes, all anarchist takes are subject to pull the chair in basketball, where if I play basketball, it's at least, among normally heighted people, I'm usually in the paint, and I'm more of a big man position. And so I've got a lot of body mass and size and height. So what you do in the paint is you're positioning for power, and positioning, you're fighting for position. And then if someone's really leaning hard against you, if you're quick enough, you move out of the way and down they go, and you get the rebound, or you get the rebound and then the follow through shot, the putback. So that's why parasitic philosophies never endure. They're always parasitic. They always must rely on a stronger host. And it's a futile existence, because if the host gets too weak and can no longer afford the parasite dies with it. And that's the problem with all of these parasitic deconstructionist movements that we currently have. Is now parasites can have their place. The remora is a very important fish for the shark and the whale, because now I'm showing my biological limitations here, but they perform a function for the bigger fish. But if there's too many of them, the bigger fish or the mammal dies. So that's part of the point here. So it's sort of that everyone is being played, but me, because I can see through, but what he can't see is himself very well. And it's sort of a naive view of the good. But I think this video is helpful. I thought the early sections on trolling were excellent. I thought Peterson's engagement with him was fair. I didn't see a lot of movement in there, and I think the reason is because Malice can't see himself thoroughly enough to, I think, appreciate some of Peterson's points. But we all have difficulty seeing ourselves. And I think Peterson in some ways is susceptible to this, but not nearly as much as Peterson's critics think he is. Now, I'm going to jump in after the trolling conversation and into the death of mass media section of the video.
So what if I said, maybe we should just stop caring about that too, because the technological playing field for communication has been leveled so drastically that the New York Times and the legacy media types are basically dead in the water, and that's just going to play out like inevitably over the next 3 or 4 years. And let me give you just a quick example.
Can I just say one sentence?
Please.
If they were dead in the water, the lockdowns couldn't have happened.
I think Malice is dead on right about that. And that's, when I hear the statement that mass media is dead, not really. It's certainly in decline. I just finished talking with Paul Anleitner. We're seeing the beginning of the end of the secular age, but these things move very slowly. So that obviously caught Peterson. It's good point. So concede it. I mean, when your debate adversary makes a good point, say good point. It's a good point.
I don't think they're dead in the water now, but I think the writing's on the wall.
I agree. That's why I'm going to write a book called The White Pill, because I'm so optimistic. I think they're on borrowed time. Completely agree.
So then we can also talk about what happens next, and we can talk about the difference between podcasts and legacy media too, which I think I'm trying to think through right now, and because I think the YouTube podcast long form structure is revolutionary in all sorts of ways that we are just starting to understand. I was talking to Russell Brand a week ago, and he talked about voiceless people and how we're increasingly becoming voiceless. And I thought,
okay, now throughout this whole video that I'm going to do, we have to get a handle on, remember I said epistemic storm. That's sort of something I'm borrowing from Rebel Wisdom, but also principality collapse. Rebel Wisdom won't talk about principalities. Where am I getting that word from? I'm getting that word from the New Testament. What's a principality? And now I'm sort of more over on the Peugeot side. A principality is a disembodied person, or we might call a disembodied person a spirit. And what we're seeing is the collapse of the reigning principality. And we're seeing the rise and the competition for that preeminence from other principalities. What was helpful from Michael Malice's words was the way he goes about this nicely reveals that we are not what we think we are. What do I mean by that? We think we are these autonomous, discrete, individual human beings that are walking around fully in control of ourselves. Again, for the last 100 years, we've had psychology that has been casting deep skepticism and doubt on that. We have depth psychologists that are saying, there's far more things working underneath. And to the joy of some of you, the longer I think about this, the more I appreciate some of Jung's frameworks on this. Because we are not our own. Our mouths are being moved by spirits. And Michael Malice's sort of strident, sophomoric critique has some credence. He's right about this. What we see are individuals who are being mobilized and moved by mass audiences. And the whole Trump administration was in some degree the art of the troll. Now, where I want to take that a step further is I would say that, in fact, it is not the case, and this is where conspiracy theories tend to fall short. And again, I agreed with a lot of what Michael Malice said in terms of his critique of the present order. And that's basically where Peterson is. And so Peterson explores the limits to the degree which he can agree with Michael Malice in this. There are principalities that continue to be at work. And part of the blindness of materialism, which is also fading away with the fading of secularity, is the recognition that there are agencies above us that are systems both manifest and our systems are both participating and to a degree creating. What I mean by that is spirits can be born. What do I mean by that? Well, Peterson's about to describe some of the spirit that is created by mass media and its limitations. And the limitations of that spirit are exactly what we see when we see new spirits, new principalities arise. You know, consider Facebook a principality. Consider Twitter a principality. What do I mean by that? These are spirits. Or what is a spirit? A spirit is the thing that moves and shapes and conforms matter, material. It's connected to the formal cause in some ways. That's when we talk about spirits, and I'm intentionally using that word and connecting it to religious mythology and tradition, because a big part of the question of re-enchantment, I still haven't listened to Peugeot's conversation with very high status woman Orthodox writer whose name escapes me right now, but I saw that he talked to her, and right away I started watching it, right away they began talking about why she didn't like the word re-enchantment, and that's a real point, because re-enchantment isn't the better word. And so we're still emerging, feeling this out, waiting for some emanation of a word that will bring it together. Okay?
Well, wait a second. That's true in one sense, perhaps. But it's very untrue in another sense that might be more important, because now everyone's a TV station if they want to be, and everyone's a radio station if they want to be, and everyone's a publishing house if they want to be.
And that's true, but everyone is not a TV station, because a TV station in its framework could assume a number of listeners. I would assume most TV stations on YouTube, I mean, this station included, video gets between, most of my videos, at least in the first little while, in the first month will get between 1 and 5,000 views. It's nothing. It's nothing. No, it's not nothing, but it's very small. And so when he says that, yes and no.
It's right there at their fingertips.
Sure.
And there's no, apart from impediments that get thrown up now and then, like YouTube banning people and so on, it's if you want to have a voice, all you have to do is buy a $100 microphone and use your laptop and bang, you have whatever audience you can draw in.
Whatever audience you can draw in. What is the thing that decides whether you're going to draw an audience in or not? That is something too. Now, one of the things, part of, so you have data and you have narrative and you have icons. Part of what narrative does is wed thing and process. Okay? And by the time I get to the McGilchrist conversation with Peterson, we're going to have to grapple a bit with process theology. Process theology is helpful because it brings process into the theological framework, which had been deeply compromised by modernity. I'll say it that way. And So Peterson is saying, well, anybody can be a TV station. Oh, but you're forgetting the principalities, because some are going to focus people on there. I mean, so when, back in the days of MP3, well, we will need to democratize music. So anybody can be a star. No. There's the Pareto distribution too. What is that principality? What is that spirit that we're wrestling with? See, what am I doing? What are you doing, Vanderclay? You're using biblical language in this frame. Yeah, because I want to connect the frames. My entire journey over the last 3 years has been to connect these frames, to figure out, because you go to church and you have Ascension Day and you think nothing of the fact that Jesus flies up into the sky and disappears behind a cloud, and that a medievalist or an ancient would have, that story would have been filled with meaning that the modern person is, for the most part, completely unaware of. Even though if you ask a 6-year-old, where do good people go when they die? Up. And how about bad people? Down. Where did you get that idea? Well, maybe they don't have it anymore. Maybe those ideas were still around. So in other words, there's a lot going on here that we don't see very easily. And actually, again, Michael Malice in this, with his anarchism and the stuff that he was saying, is helping to reveal some of the principalities in our midst and expose them for what they are. But when I listen to him, I see all sorts of other principalities into him that he seems unaware of.
Yeah.
And that is playing itself out in our culture extraordinarily rapidly. And so maybe that's just like the 4chan discussion that's drawn from your book, The New Right. The culture's moved past that. That's already history. It might be the case that the continued dominance of the main narrative by the legacy media types, that's already done. We're just mopping up the ashes.
That's exactly my perspective, and this is why it's often so frustrating with me on social media, because I think it's inevitable. I don't see how, if I'm the New York Times, or if I ask myself this question fairly often. I said, if I'm CNN, what could I do to regain the trust of this young population? Like, what steps would I take? And they're really in a bad, it's like Marlboro. Like, one of my quotes is, I said, the battle is won when the average American regards a corporate journalist exactly as they regard a tobacco executive. You are never going to have the guy who runs Marlboro be someone that you trust and think is like an unmitigated good person. You understand his job. You might say, look, these have to be legal. It's a horrible habit of, and so on and so forth. And I get how he's getting a paycheck, and I get how it could be used in moderation. But regardless, there's better ways to improve humanity than selling tobacco.
Well, I look at the BBC.
Let me give the Marlboro man his due. I regularly work with people who are heavy users of tobacco, and I know full well it is shortening their life. What is that tobacco doing? First of all, tobacco built America. No, I've got to readjust my video. I forgot my audio. Hang on. So I look at a friend. This friend has significant enough disabilities so that he can be on disability. And he smokes. Now, he'd have a whole lot more money if he didn't have that bad habit. Why does he smoke? What he's doing when he's smoking is basically something analogous to what he's doing when he's taking the anti-anxiety medication he gets from his psychiatrist. He doesn't live a good life. And I don't mean that morally. I mean, he's living on disability. So whether some of my friends are homeless, living on disability, some of my friends are living in group homes, living on disability, they don't have much. They smoke. Smoking's going to end their life. Maybe it's better if they go quicker with lung cancer. I don't know. I'm not going to weigh in there and take it. America was built on tobacco. America was built on the marriage of religious zealots looking to build the kingdom of God on earth. Those are the Puritans. And drug dealers. Those are the Virginia's tobacco farmers. Tobacco was the big drug of the 16th century, followed by sugar, followed by all the other big drugs that we have that are legal. Sugar, alcohol, tobacco. They're all drugs. They're powerful drugs. So let's give the Marlboro Man his due.
BBC, for example, tried to formulate a channel for young people, and they did exactly what you'd expect, appeal to progressive causes. And the truth of them, that didn't work at all. And why didn't it work? It's because for young people, broadcast TV is so dead that they don't even notice the corpse.
Yeah.
Like, right. It's just not there.
That's a good line.
Just not an issue. And no wonder, because the technological advantage of on-demand video, both production and consumption, is so that the advantage of that is so great that those old forms are just, they're terminally dead. And so when I go and have an interview with a TV person, you know, it feels like I'm going back into the 70s, and I'm not doing them anymore.
Okay, well, now we're getting at principalities here. So listen to this part carefully.
And I can get into that in a little while. But what happens is, you know, the person that you're talking to isn't a person, and whatever it is that you're having isn't a conversation. We're having a conversation when we're doing this right. You know, I'm sure we bring our flaws to this and our arbitrary preconceptions and our biases and all that. But my sense is that when a podcast goes well, I can tell because I'm interested in the conversation. And the reason I'm interested in the conversation isn't because I've got some viewpoints that I'm hammering forward that you have to attend to, but that I've got some ideas that I can throw at you, and then I can see what you do with the ideas and take them apart and add what you can to them. And then...
Okay, so now interest here is in some ways a function of a spirit that has us. It's what do I mean by spirit? I say it's embodied. No, it's psychological. It's through and through in us. But interest is not our conscious self. We might say, don't be interested in this and do be interested in that. That's the kid who is supposed to turn off Netflix and study his classroom work and is unable to. Why? Because Netflix is more interesting. Why? What in him makes Netflix more interesting? And what in him makes this particular show that everybody is watching? You turn on Netflix and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? The most watched shows. And just the fact that they're most watched, it's because we're deeply connected with all of these other beings. We are not individuals just by ourselves. Well, what is connecting us? Are there strings? No, there's no strings on me. What is connecting us? It's this storyverse. It's reputation. It's a whole bunch of things under the surface that are connecting me with all those other people. You know, one of the biggest things I thought about Michael Malice is he needs to read Rene Girard, because he thinks that it's all liberty and we're all free to do what we want. Well, where are those desires coming from? We're borrowing them from our neighbors. I just... So Nate Heil, I should mention Nate. I really got to get him on the show. We really got to schedule that. Nate Heil is active in the Discord community. He has his own channel. He's up on the Randos channel. And Nate is a Christian anarchist. And he's like, oh, good, you're going to watch an anarchist. I'm thinking, well, where exactly is the intersection between Christian anarchism and this guy? And, you know, fortunately, according to Nate, he mentioned some names like Jacques Ellul. And okay, well, this kind of guy I can talk to. This other kind of thing I don't have a lot of respect for. But Nate sent me a really interesting article about Rene Girard's treatment of Nietzsche. Oh, that was very interesting. Because our desires are not our own either. You know, some of them are certainly deeply tied biological, but they're of course completely embedded and brought in with the sociological. You know, I'd always have the situation. Okay, get your PVK bingo card out. Here comes a Dominican Republic square. in the Dominican Republic, the woman that our housekeeper, let's call her, because I went down there and it's like, I'll be darned if I'm going to have some, coming back from my experience growing up in Patterson, the civil rights movement, no way I'm going to have some person with darker skin than myself working in my house doing dishes and cleaning the floors. I did. Why? The other argument, you've got all this money and you're not giving people a job? And are you and your wife going to do all this cleaning with these tile floors and no emissions on cars, yada, 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 yada. So yeah, you have this woman in our house cleaning, and lovely woman, attractive young woman, slender. She used to complain about how she was flaquita. She's just this little skinny thing. Dominican men liked women with meat on their bones. Then you'd inevitably have the situation where you'd bring in a work team, and this woman from North America who doesn't seem to be able to turn heads because she's got a little bit more meat on her bone, she gets down to the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican men are all over her. Partly because she's got an American passport, but partly because they like the curves, baby. And, there's some of this in the American, African-American community too, some of these different dynamics, but yeah. So where do these desires come from? The problem with Malice is that he imagines that he's just this autonomous individual just out there doing what he wants. And it's like, no, your desires, you borrow them too. You're connected with them too. Everyone is chasing the same girls. All the girls are chasing the same guys. But there's both biology and social construction in those matrices as well. It's tremendously complex. Anyway, back to the principality, because Peterson's just about to name a principality that he sees.
And I can have different ideas, and we can do that collaboratively over the course of the dialogue, and we can include all the people that are watching this in the process. And it's like this long form allows for the truth being something like an investigation into the truth instead of the truth. And
right.
And now when he says that, I think immediately of the most important preaching class I had when I was at Calvin Seminary was not a homiletics class. It was my church education class where I got this book. What is this book all about? This book is basically updating while at the mainstream at Sunday where we're preaching, but in Christian education we're bringing in all this educational philosophy. When I went to the Dominican Republic, they were still teaching Sunday school via rote memorization. If you look at the Heidelberg Catechism, it's a tool that was developed when the presumed method of education was rote memorization. Rote memorization was a terrifically important educational practice before the development of the printing press and before books got very, very cheap. Fast forward a while later, why nobody learns anything in church and how to fix it. Some of you might notice that, why do I always use PowerPoint when I preach? Well, because there are auditory learners, there are visual learners, and there are kinesthetic learners. It's a lot more difficult in a church frame to add in the kinesthetic aspects of learning. Although, if you look at liturgical churches, they've been doing it forever. Stand up, sit down, move front, move back, all around. Why all the kinesthetics in church liturgy? Because that's part of it, because the movement gets into you as well. So education has changed.
Well, we don't want to underestimate how much of that is purely a consequence of the technological revolution. Because now there's time, right? We can make mistakes, and it doesn't matter because the bandwidth is unlimited.
Yeah, if I'm a roulette player, and I mentioned this in the book as well,
Why is his video so crappy? Now, I shouldn't want to say this. Go look at all my older videos. But no, this dude's, that's a horrible picture. Dude, get a better camera.
Money is on technology being what...
And the sound doesn't sound too good either. Get a better, are you using the mic on those cheap Apple headphones? Come on.
saves us. I think politics literally only causes problems, and it's not a place for any kind of solution. You cannot look to Washington.
See, those statements are too much. And you might have heard me say similar statements. I'm much more of a religious believer than a political believer. But I've lived in countries where politics is a lot worse.
For solutions. What's funny is when you listen to corporate media, a lot of times they will acknowledge something's a problem, but then when that problem is solved exterior to it, they start to panic. We have heard, you and I.
And again, when he says something like that, I think, amen, dead on right. That is so true.
Both old enough to remember that there was a lot of hand-wringing correctly, that we live in a soundbite culture, that it's not reasonable that a politician who might have a new innovative way to solve for poverty, to solve for the environment, to solve for, out of wedlock births, they have some program, but they have to wrap it up in 10 seconds. It's very hard to make that point. And as a result, this rewards glib people or people who have good one-liners, but someone who's inarticulate, who has great ideas, that person is going to be dead in the water. And that's going to create results that we not necessarily like. So then people are like, you know what, this is true. Like you have people talking past each other, the Republican versus Democrat, broadly what they're going to say. It's fun when they get a zinger in, but I'm not going to have the needle moved. I'm rooting for my team, and it's kind of a sports phenomenon. Podcasts come along. We're going to have a long conversation where both of us are listening to each other. I might disagree with you. I don't have a political party behind me. Neither do I.
Well, hopefully you'll disagree with me. Hopefully that you'll do
Hold
it.
on.
Not only will you disagree, but more importantly, that you'll do it in an interesting way that's interesting also to me, because if you disagree with me, there is some possibility that you know something I don't. And if you disagree, I could learn something from you.
Yeah, the smartest person is ignorant of 99.99% of knowledge. This is the mistake that these kind of overeducated people think. They think just because I'm smart, I know everything. You're still going to be profoundly ignorant. You're just going to be knowledgeable about certain things very specifically. But getting back to the point I was.
Okay, so I thought all of that was really good points, and I thought it was well said and well done. But you have to apply this to yourself. We're always going to be dumber, and so this is part of how Michael Malice's position deconstructs itself. He just made an argument that the corporate mind is smarter than the individual mind all along, bashing on corporations. Why do we call them corporations? What does this word corporate? It's a principality. It's a Voltron. It's a distributed agency that is made up of lots of people, subsidiary people. And there are people that are closer to the top and closer to the bottom. But if you have ever been the CEO of anything, you know very well that in some ways, the most impotent chair in the entire company is the top chair, because all the eyeballs are on it, and all of that corporate principality, that corporate spirit binds you into so many things. Now, you might still have more power than just about everybody else in the corporation, but the corporation still has power over you. And in some ways, this is the connection between the meta-divine realm and the Hebraic conception. And that's so the corporation itself is a principality. And this is where spirits are born.
Was saying earlier, now that we have these long conversations and people can really delve into ideas, and people listening to us might think we're both full of crap, but now they're at least challenging their own views and being like, why do I disagree with both of them? You don't have that space on CNN by nature of its organization. And now what CNN and other outlets had correctly posited as a problem has been resolved, but it's been resolved at their expense. So now the hue and cry is there's misinformation. People are being told dangerous ideas. Yeah, it's dangerous to your hegemony.
Okay, so now we're talking about epistemic storm and principality collapse. The principality, there's war in the heavens. Okay, remember Zach Stein, War in the Heavens? There's war in the heavens. Principalities are being dethroned. New principalities are rising. That brings instability. Nobody likes living in a war zone, or few people like living in a war zone. We are living in a war zone, but the war zone is in the heavens, and we're sort of down below. Now, fortunately, it's not a war currently with bullets or armies or the kinds of things that we see when war goes all the way down to the physical level. Right now, the war's still just in the heavens, but it's a war.
It's dangerous to your prominence. CNN, Brian Stelter, had a whole segment. I don't think he named Tim Pool by name, by saying, how is it that these YouTube shows, news shows, have orders of magnitude bigger than us? What do we do about this? It's like, this is literally every market. Like, I'm a publisher or I make apples. Someone comes along, their apples are, people like those apples better. You know, you don't call in the
Okay. People like those apples better. And you see, Malice keeps heading back and forth over the line on this. People like these apples better. Oh, that just shows quality. People like these apples better. No, those people are dupes of other principalities. Both are true. And they're both true in the same universe, and you're not getting away from that.
State, you don't regard this as some kind of abomination against the natural order of things. You're like, okay, crap, what nerve is Tim striking that I can learn from? But they're never interested in that, because they're not interested in learning. They're interested in teaching, or more specifically training their audiences what to think and believe. And you see this
and now Tim Pool, but he's the same, isn't he? Because if he grows and becomes corporate, well, you know, this is part of the reason I always say hierarchies bind and blind. They do. Corporations, principalities bind and blind. They always do. They must, because they are narrowing, because they are offering constraint. Because the only way you get production is with constraint. I'll say, so you've got emergence. If it's just all emergence, well, it's basically like, how do you have a nozzle on the end of your hose? Well, you've got, let's say, a 3/4 inch hose, and you put on a nozzle, and you have just a little 1/4 inch nozzle at the end. You get power. You get work done. Okay. Now, a little bit later, I'm going to play the clips from Bari Weiss, where she's going through the same dynamic with respect to the New York Times. But notice how she talks about it differently. Malice, I think, doesn't see himself or know himself well enough, or know the dynamics of this, to see that deconstruction always serves a reconstruction, and anarchism doesn't in itself have a reconstruction. And where I'd say, without quite knowing what Nate Heil thinks about Christian anarchism would in a sense be a deconstructive phase nested within the construction of heaven. In other words, that kind of anarchism would be mortification. And what I see here from Malice is it's all mortification, but he doesn't have anything underneath. If you walk into a room and the floor is covered with rubble, the reason you remove the rubble is to get at the floor. The difficulty that I see here is I don't know that there's a floor to be uncovered, to be washed, and to be polished, and then to bring furniture into the room.
Social media. I made this joke over the weekend. In the same way that Christians regard the Trinity as one God in 3 person, you have these entire populations, which is one mind in many, many persons.
There you go. That's a principality. That's a corporation. One mind in many, many persons. Now, it usually inhabits those persons partially, maybe during the hours that they're at work, or during the hours, but it monitors them partially. Totalitarian corporations or systems try to take the whole person. They are always unstable, and they always get overthrown because you've got the tension between the corporation and the individual. And there's always tension there. Now, we'll keep going.
Because the people will watch John Oliver, or they'll watch, some other show on the right. And the next day, not only will they be repeating these views, but they're repeating them verbatim.
Why is Michael Malice on YouTube and writing books? Because he is trying to colonize people himself. He is participating in a principality that is going to war against the John Oliver principality. There's a war in the heavens. Spirits are being born. There's far fewer spirits being born. They often get recycled.
And that is when you realize, oh, there's no mind there. We're trained since we're kids correctly that it's important for us to be informed on current events. So what these shows do very perniciously is they will bring up...
Perniciously. Notice how he added the value judgment. Okay, where are these values coming from?
an issue that the person hadn't heard about before, which is important for us to understand, sure, but immediately we'll train them on how to look at this issue and what their correct emotional response is. And people are hungry for that because
what the correct emotional response is. This gets back into Peterson's maps of meaning, because, yeah, you are trained and your emotional responses are trained. And see, here's the problem with Malice, is because all these other people out here are non-pair characters, except for me. Really? How can you be so sure? I'm skeptical. The crazy thing is you have to be skeptical of the degree to which you yourself are a non-player character. Then you have to ask the question, tell me what spirit is strong enough to begin to contend with all of these other spirits. This is the Prince of Persia question. What is the Prince of Persia? Read in the book of Daniel that, was it Gabriel or Michael? The archangel wants to bring a message to Daniel, but he had to contend with the Prince of Persia. Again, you hear this and we go, oh, that's religion, all this mythology, all this literalism. Ah. All this stuff is being played out before our own eyes. The spirit of anarchism is contending with the spirit of John Oliver right here and now. Now, mass media, John Oliver, HBO, he's got a bigger mic than Michael Malice. But then Peterson says, he tells the story often. In the green room, he sits down with his interviewer and they chat about something. And Peterson, in that sense, says the real person. But once they get in the chair, once they get on the throne, once they get in the studio, once you get in the court of the principality of the Prince of HBO, John Oliver isn't going to say just whatever he wants. And to the degree there's unusual people that can, let's say someone like Bill Maher, well, he's achieved a certain high status. And so the principality that Bill Maher contends with the principality of HBO, and they sign a contract and they collaborate and they say, this is best for both of us, until Bill Maher says something that HBO just can't stand, and off they go. This is a war in the heavens. That's how these spirits work. And again, you're like, well, you mentioned Frank Peretti. Is that how these spirits work? Well, sort of. I'm not sure that particular narrative really communicates well, but there's the spirit of anarchism that is speaking through, there's a spirit of anarchism that is speaking through Michael Malice, and it's contending with the spirit of HBO, with the Blue Church spirit that is contending through John Oliver. And Jordan Peterson is sort of in blue religion, but also, because none of us are pure. And part of the reason that the spirits of each of us is different is, well, because we've got all of these other spirits in us too. So then the harder question is, where can we find ourselves? And this is what, of course, leads into the meaning crisis.
Because they want to present themselves as informed, but they don't have the time or the capacity to undertake the critical or independent thought to do that. So it comes prepackaged for them.
Independent thought? Tell me where this independent thought comes from. Or is it just other thoughts and the mismatch and the half ideas of 1,000 other thoughts and the biases and temperaments and all of those? I mean, this is the formed person, the person who, when David Fuller was talking to Jonathan Rowsome, Rowsome basically said, this is completely, and David Fuller stops and says, completely? Because right there is the meaning crisis.
For them. So it's kind of the TV dinner of the mind. Well, that's a good metaphor.
But the network format, all of it, the whole technological apparatus.
Okay, so now Peterson's going to describe the construction, the birth of the spirit, the construction of the principality, the part of what gives that principality its shape.
Including the corporate funding as a consequence of the expensive bandwidth, absolutely demands that.
Yes.
I never feel more like content than when I go to a TV station. And everyone in there is in some sense held hostage to the limitations and advantages of that particular technology. And
they're in bondage to the spirits. They're held hostage. I mean, Peterson's just basically saying it, but he's not using language that I think reveals the bigger picture. how the people on the throne in the studio are in fact the manifestation of the gods of HBO or BBC4 speaking through them. They're the prophet, they're the king, they're the Pontius. What is a Pontius? A Pontius is a bridge. Kathy Newman was the Pontius of a spirit of BBC4, the spirit of which David Fuller was exorcised.
You know what? Well, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
a lot of what looks like even corporate think or corporate malfeasance is merely a consequence of that strange technological limitation. The networks have to assume that everybody watching has no memory and no education and no attention span because the bandwidth requirements demand that. And now that's all gone. So let me ask you about this. So now all of a sudden, the network, everyone's a TV station. Okay, so now one thing that
Okay, see, there's the transition. There's the war in the heavenlies. So now it's YouTube versus HBO. But they're both principalities. And you might say, well, does the technology create the principality or participate in the principality? I don't think that distinction reveals a lot.
That the dominance, let's say, of the three major TV stations from, say, 1950 or thereabouts till 1995, maybe something like that, there was the imposition of something like a coherent national narrative. And now you can object to that, and you should, because in some sense...
Okay, so these principalities, they serve other bigger, larger principalities.
It's imposed, but you know, it's a collaborative imposition between these technologically powerful companies and the government. The journalists couldn't be too corrupt if they chased after the politicians, because then they wouldn't get access, and the politicians couldn't be too corrupt because the media would, you know, disrobe them.
And the morality that was in the nation beneath. I mean, why was JFK was a sex addict? Okay? Betting Hollywood starlets at the White House. Okay? The press looked the other way. Why? In the national interest. Martin Luther King Jr. was, you know, having affairs, cheating on his wife, and the other ministers looked the other way. Why?
There was this sense of unity, and now you get this immense multiplicity. And so, I mean, you're more...
Epistemic storm, principality collapse, war in the heavens.
Anarchically oriented, I would say, temperamentally than I am, but...
Oh, I am an anarchist, yes.
Right. But you know, there is a danger in fragmentation. That's diversity is fragmentation, but you know, enough fragmentation, you get nothing but endless conflict as people try to work out how they're going to cooperate. So
I don't think that's necessarily true, because I think you're taking it as a given that cooperation is desirable, or that this unity of some kind is desirable. I think what's coming up in certain circles, which I was the first one.
And this is exactly the line between these two right here in this conversation.
To posit this in 2015 is, in America at least, the idea of a national divorce. Recognizing that we've had at least two cultures since the very beginning. They're being held together through, you know, often nefarious means. And if one group regards Donald Trump as literally Hitler and an authoritarian strongman, which you can very easily make the case for that, and the other group regards, you know, Joe Biden as basically someone sitting in his own urine behind the Resolute desk, there's no reason other than some kind of sense of inertia for these two or more groups to be under the same polity, or both. There's no reason for you to have...
Really? Who does it serve to have America divide its house between two other things? Who does that serve? Well, now suddenly I just expanded. What other principalities does it serve to have America divided? You know, he can't recognize the good of cooperation. All cooperation is tyranny. What?
The president you don't want. And increasingly, as conversation becomes and discourse collapses, because I think social media does tend to drive our ideologies to their logical conclusions, which leads to extremism, which could be both a good thing or a bad thing. It is going to be harder and harder to the point where it's impossible to, have these sort of conversation. And we're seeing it also in Europe.
But there are reasons for the necessity of the unity. I mean, so you talk about Jonathan Haidt in your book, in the New Right. And there's a lot of psychological investigators, myself included, when I was doing research, who were looking into the temperamental basis of political affiliation.
Right.
And so, roughly speaking, on the left end of things, you get the high open people who are creative in their thinking and
yes,
and who are temperamentally in favor of the free flow of information, and tend to be lower in conscientiousness, particularly orderliness. And then you have people who lie on the other side of that, who are higher in orderliness and lower in openness. And I tried to figure out why that was the fundamental political axis, because there's 5 temperaments.
Yes.
So why only those 2 as the major determinants of political affiliation? And what it boiled down to for me is that, and I think this isn't my discovery precisely, but I think it's the most significant discovery in political psychology in the last 50 years, is that it's probably that because borders are the fundamental political issue. And I don't just mean borders between countries. I mean borders between concepts. I mean borders between categories, countries, states, towns, people. The conservative types think you have to hold things together.
Yep.
Because if they dissolve, they die. And the liberal types think, well, wait a second, you bloody well need to maximize information flow. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes one of those perspectives is right for that situation and sometimes the other. And it's even look at the advantages of free trade and then the disadvantage of, a worldwide epidemic. That's a great example. It's like, well, are open borders good? Well, they do facilitate the transmission of disease. And it turns out that the probability that infectious disease...
And what happens if you have a closed border, like the Americas before the Columbian Exchange, before Columbus, the Europeans came over? What did those closed borders do for you? Well, you have no natural immunity. Your civilization and most of your people are dead. So, these are tremendously complex things.
Disease will be transmitted in a given political locale is actually a very good determinant of political belief within that locale. So wherever there's more infectious disease, people are much more conservative, and it's a huge effect. So something very fundamental is going on at the bottom of our political thinking. But having said all that, that also means that both of those types are necessary, because sometimes one has the right solution and sometimes the other. But even more importantly is that there's no way of getting rid of that dichotomy if you have groups of human beings. And so if we can't have a unity emerge that allows both those types of people to coexist, then what we're going to have as a consequence is conflict.
And you're never going to get rid of the need of community between people of different dispositions with respect to, let's say, openness and borders. You're going to have some in a family that are more open than others. And in fact, it's the frameworks and it's the collaborative structures by which the differences can actually be held together fruitfully that make it possible to do all sorts of things. And that's, diversity and unity. These are these 2 very different things. And so you've got all of these principalities, and what you need is that there needs to be something above the principalities. Well, in paganism, it's the meta-divine realm. But there needs to be something that transcends the principalities.
And who knows how severe that can become. So we have a choice. It's like unity, however fragile that might be, or the degeneration into something like conflict. And that's not preferable to cooperation, all things considered.
Oh, I disagree. I think it is comparable, and I don't think the alternatives, I don't think that the unity means cooperation. I think unity means oppression.
Sometimes I don't disagree with that in some sense.
I'm saying all the time, unity through politics always means oppression, because
And when he said this, I thought, oh, Jordan's sitting across the table from, this is woke by a different name.
Political system can only be used to silence people and force them to do what they otherwise would not want to do. Otherwise, they would do it on a voluntary basis.
And his assumption, his moral assumption underneath that assumption is, and that's bad. That's wrong. That's evil. Why? Because the individual will is sacrosanct and sacred. Oh, but is the individual will really in isolation? Again, Rene Girard. A good bit of that will is also borrowed and colonized by levels below and principalities around. Your will is not your own. Please believe me. Just play with your diet. Eat a bunch of sugars and carbs. And what do you want? Sugars and carbs. I just want it. I just want it. Oh, really? Talk to me about that. Someone wants to get their porn habit under control, but they're doing all of these other things. And it's like, it's gonna feed into it. Someone wants to, I just don't know why I can't stop cheating on my wife. Well, maybe you need a different job. Our wills are not our own. I mean, we are, again, epithumia, over desires. If you understand the Bible deeply enough, you will see that it is all through all of these conversations. These are nothing new. You can translate it into different words, and perhaps the problem that happened in preaching was, in a sense, they had so much success they isolated themselves, and the insularity meant they no longer were able to be connected with these kinds of conversations. This is actually a pretty good thumbnail that I should grab a second. I always need these thumbnails for the titles, My channel is built on the cheap and fast. That's how I prioritize this. So let's pause here and continue on. Now, as I said before, and I mentioned in my other videos, and again, part of the reason I do these videos is because the process of doing these videos sparks insight for me. And so as I was rewatching Peterson and Bari Weiss, and I was struggling because they're waiting for emanation to give them a logos in which to understand exactly what they're losing and what they're talking about. Jordan Hall's language of deep code and blue church came up, and I realized that not all of you are as familiar with that, and I need to be more familiar with it. And so look at what they just talked about principalities. And now that we see the dynamic of principalities, let's take a look at the principality that has been at work amongst us since, notice Jordan Peterson, 1950 to maybe 1995. And I want to listen to some of this Jordan Hall interview. There are a variety of videos out there that treat it, and I looked at a bunch of different ones, but I thought this one gets at the elements fairly well.
As a group. The Blue Church emerged in the context of having to figure out how to navigate all of these changes and generate coherence. How do we get all of these people?
Okay, so he starts out this section on coherence, and I'm trying to limit exactly how much of each of these videos I'm playing, just for the sake of brevity, because it's going to be long anyway. Starts out talking about coherence, and he talks about the fact that if let's say you get in a canoe and you have a paddle, well, it's fairly straightforward. But there is all this coherence that you actually started building up when you were in the womb before you were born, and then after you're born, you start finding your thumb and learning to use your hands. So all of this internal bodily coherence, and once you achieve that coherence among the various elements of your members, remember the videos that I've done lots about member versus individual, when I was talking about the rebel wisdom, Rowson, David Fuller conversation. So we're already working on the coherence among our members. Principalities, corporations work on coherence among their members too. But as individuals, so in a canoe you're paddling, it's fairly straightforward. And then let's say you go to a rowboat. Now now you're going to have to row. That's a little bit different. But now let's say you're in a boat with 2 people or more, and you're rowing or you're paddling, and you need coherence between the 2 people. This is cooperation. Now, these categoricals that Michael Malice is saying, all that cooperation is oppressive, unless it's somehow voluntary. Well, see, but these lines between the volition and they're not that clear. And so Jordan Hall makes the point that this coherence has to scale up, and it scales up on a massive level. The problem with Michael Malice's position is, well, your cell phone company is tyrannical. It is, but you use it anyway. Yes, you do. YouTube is tyrannical. It is, but you use it anyway. Yes, you do. In fact, you can't get anything done in this interconnected, collaborative world without cooperation and collaboration. So, but now he's going to talk about Blue Church, which is the particular iteration of this that has both, because of the American empire and its hegemonic position with respect to the world, which has dominated the world from the second half of the 20th century and is at decline presently.
With these new capacities to be able to make sense of the world in some fashion that is able to then make choices together and to act effectively. Right? That's the question. And the Blue Church developed to be the answer to that question. Right? So it developed the ability to say, for example, use the education system to establish an embodied sense of vertical meritocratic hierarchy. Right? The idea that some people are better at others in knowing certain kinds of things. We can find them, and then we empower them to have hierarchical authority.
Now, in the Malice video, you can listen to Jordan Peterson talk about Harvard, and actually to talk about how Harvard used an SAT test, which is basically an IQ test, in order to get these people to Harvard. And of course, Peterson taught at Harvard, and so he knows, and he had a lot of praise for the psychology department at Harvard. But it was also very interesting before, because before that it was sort of like an elite, and it's like, no, Jordan, before that it was a religious institution, and they were picking other aspects. It was a Protestant institution. It was part of the religious zealot, the religious zealot half of the marriage between the religious fanatic and the drug dealer. That's what Harvard and Yale, these Ivy League schools. Read George Marsden's, let's see if I have it here. Read George Marsden's book on the history of basically the secularization of the American universities.
In the structure that we're in. And then we add others in knowing certain kinds of things. We can find them, and then we empower them to have hierarchical authority.
Okay, now these are all functions of this principality that we've been living under and within and participating in.
The structure that we're in. And I should say this, by the way, both formally and informally. The role of being in class is teaching that. Whether the content of the story of the class, whatever the content of the class is, the experience of the student is the teacher's in charge. Our job is just to listen. And some of us are smart, and they get to be teachers or in charge, right? That's the story of school. And it's very important, that first part, that there's a relationship between authority and receptor that has a broadcast modality. So the Blue Church is very broadcast across its entire mode. So what I mean by broadcast, of course, is exemplified in television, which is to say that some small number of people get to speak, and a very, very large number of people get to listen. And so it's very different than say, what we're doing right here. This is symmetric. While, of course, I'm the one speaking, in principle, there's nothing about this conversation that couldn't be perfectly symmetric. But
now, when Michael Malice talked about lockdowns and COVID, he had a point, and he was right, and I pointed that out. But one of the first things that I saw in COVID was the difference, as Chris Arnott calls, between front row and back row America. And I'm going to take Chris Arnott's language and I'm going to steal it and I'm going to change it. And I'm going to call it front seat and back seat America. Because the members of the front seat are driving. And of course, there's a hierarchy there in that very strange car. But the members of the front seat and the front seats are driving and the members in the back seats aren't. And that goes all the way back to the classroom. Because, well, we're choosing for IQ, so choosing for certain capacities. Backseat America, you know, unless they did very strict lockdowns, the kinds of which that I heard coming out of Australia, here in California, some people, I mean, they couldn't go into their stores, but the stores are run by the hierarchies, but they met with family. Their life didn't stop. They're not getting a vaccine. They live in backseat America. They're not in the educational systems. They're not listening to the news. They're not participating in any of that. They're in many ways defying the hierarchy. They're defying the patriarchy. They're defying the principality. And they sleep outside and but they tend to be under the sway of other principalities. And so there's always war in the heavenlies.
Television and any kind of broadcast modality, it's structurally that way. So Walter Cronkite tells the news and everybody else watches it. And there's a lot of passivity there. Like, my job is not to perceive what's going on, make sense of it, and then express it in the world. My job is to see the story that I'm being told and be able to then express that story effectively in the society that I'm in. And I call this good sense, the emergence of good sense. And you see an emerging mesh of good sense. You know, who are the authoritative speakers, whether they're NBC News or they're the New York Times. And there's a diversity, of course. There's a variety of different perspectives in the authoritative framework. The Blue Church recognizes the necessity of having eyes and ears, but it also recognizes the necessity of having coherence. So there's a diversity, but there's a diversity within a particular boundary. And so when you show up in society, if you are speaking good sense, if your expressions are of the sort that everybody else has broadly been hearing, or the authoritative statements, then you're showing up well. And if you aren't, then you're showing up poorly. And you'll notice that. Like, if you begin to say things that are contrary.
Now, the irony between a lot of this, especially if you're paying attention to front seat and back seat America, especially if you're paying attention to the new, all the whiteness talk that has come about, well, there's some relationships to this. And the wokeness is supposed to be a deconstruction of whiteness, but it's very white in what they're doing with all of this. In other words, it's sort of it's a sort of a self-deconstruction that sort of continues to go down. And it's sort of deconstruction. And that's why, in a lot of ways, Michael Malice and what he's doing in the woke, they're just playing the same game. They're doing the same thing. They're doing it in different locations, and they're kind of doing it against each other, but it's basically the same thing.
Contra-narrative in a deep way, even today, much less so now, though, than like 30 years ago, then you will notice a discomfort. People get uncomfortable, viscerally, physically. And you will notice...
And again, Peterson's work in Maps of Meaning. Well, why am I feeling physically uncomfortable about this? Oh, because of lobsters. And because you're hooked into all of these other systems with other people biologically at a very deep level. You're always watching your status indicator. Am I going up or am I going down? And you feel that inside. And if you're going down, it really hurts. You become bottom lobster. And if you feel like you're ascending, you become top lobster. That's what you want to be. That's hooked into you biologically to the same degree that it's hooked into, that Dominican men were attracted to larger women, and American men were attracted to thinner women, and on and on and on and on and on. So it's not just simply biological. It's the biological and the storyverse have been deeply connected for a very long time. It's one of Peterson's main points.
That discomfort viscerally, physically, and then you'll stop doing it. And so there's a nice policing mechanism that just at the cocktail party set, particularly in places like, say, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, where the elite cachet is the most important, where the choice of social success is the choice between being elevated in the hierarchy or not. then good sense becomes even more self-policing.
Good sense or good opinion?
Sorry, good opinion. Thank you. Thank you. Good opinion. And it's actually interesting to make that distinction, because the effort of the Blue Church is actually to provide good sense. Right? What is the truth about?
And that's why it's a church. Their effort is to, I mean, the whole thing is supposed to be a sense-making apparatus by which we can positively engage the world to get not only what we want, but also the good, and to find the place to be between the good and what we want.
The war in Vietnam. But of course, it's interesting to make that distinction, because the effort of the Blue Church is actually to provide good sense. Right? What is the truth about the war in Vietnam? But of course, what it can only produce is good opinion. What is our perspective? And then make sure that everybody more or less has that. Because then you can actually have choices. You can actually make choices together. If we all more or less agree that this is the nature of reality, and we more or less agree that these kinds of actions will lead to effective results, then we're rowing the boat to the coxswain's yell. We're pushing. We have a menu that has 6 buttons. Pick which button you'd like to push. You have choice, no question. But it's in a constraint. Right? It's within a boundary condition that works. And then what happens is when you push the button, it actuates a whole lot of stuff. We've all decided that we're going to have a war on poverty. So we turned the dial on the World War II era bureaucratic machinery that took us to the moon, that built the interstate highway system, and we said, okay, go out and point that engine at poverty. We're going to start building the welfare state. Go. Right? And that's what they did. And sometimes it worked. You pointed it at the moon and it got us to the moon. You pointed it at poverty and it didn't work. It really created a mess. And that tells us a lot, by the way. So I guess kind of that's that. Like, that's the Blue Church. And there's an entrainment, because this structure has Harvard is kind of at the top, and then you have the rest of the Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge. I'm sad to say that the UK lost their position. The Victorian synthesis was a UK-centric. The Blue Church was a US-centric global sense-making system. And it was broadly global, of course, through the first 3 quarters. There was the Eastern Bloc that was doing their own thing. But starting in the late 80s, totally global. And for a little bit of time there, in fact, actually functionally global. That period from 88 to maybe 1999 was a period where the Blue Church was a true hegemon and was doing stuff.
What constitutes the Blue Church? You mentioned Harvard, but it'd be good just to sketch out.
Who's part of it? Who has hierarchy in the Blue Church? I think is the question you're asking. Who has authority? Harvard. Ivy League universities, some of the sort of bigger think tanks, the Rand Corporation, significant governmental entities like,
and you can just imagine Michael Malice just, the Rand Corporation, Soros, you know.
the Department of Defense, NASA, the CIA in different domains, large corporations, GM, GE. Back in the day, when that was like when what's good for General Motors is good for America. It's a very Blue Church kind of concept. It shifted to the tech sector for a little bit. Microsoft and Apple and that kind of a thing had a little bit of cachet. Some of the media structures, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, really called the paper of record. The more formal, authoritative broadcast television programs, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN for a while, like in the heyday. By the way, just to add, the Federal Reserve is a big one. The IMF is a big one, as part of the Blue Church. The Council on Foreign Relations is a big one. And by the way, these are just like real things. Like the CFR was something that was started in the 1930s as a bunch of smart people in New York thought, hey, if we get together, we can make things happen that are better than if we don't. And
notice that we can make things better. Okay, but where does the better come from? Well, the better, it's within this entire principality. Now, it also goes outside the principality, but it's also within. And this is why we, better, all of these words are just words to watch.
Just kind of iterate on that. And that's kind of like the cocktail party set, but there's a feedback loop. Remember, I mentioned that I actually did some case studies. I actually went to places where fancy, rich people hung out, mostly Aspen and Necker, and other places like Hollywood. And what I noticed, at least my first person experience, was that there is absolutely for sure an elite conspiracy. which is just they all kind of hang out in the same place and like each other. But it has a characteristic.
Okay, and one of the things, again, in the Malice conversation is conspiracy. And Peterson, someone just recently, brought this up to me on Twitter as well. Peterson's, when the tell is they. Okay, who's the they? Well, on one hand, you want to say, well, there's no Illuminati meeting together, planning, yada, yada, yada. But just because there aren't individual human beings meeting together, doing this consciously with all of the intentionality and ritual of a corporate boardroom, doesn't mean that there isn't a distributed cognitive element, agency that is working through the systems of which the human beings are both willfully and willingly participated, and sometimes in protest. So when Bari Weiss leaves the New York Times, she no longer wants, and one of the benefits of our distributed system in the United States is she was allowed to resign from the New York Times in a way that once you're in the mob, you can't get out. Okay? That's a good thing. We want people to be able to resign. And a big part of the conversation about cancel culture now is, well, maybe they can resign from their job, or maybe they're set outside, but their reputation is attacked viciously. And so while they may no longer work for your corporation, they now will not work for any corporation. Brett and Heather Weinstein don't work at a university. Jordan Peterson doesn't work at a university. Why? Well, because there's a principality of university that is at play, and Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein crossed those gods in a certain way and are now on the outs with respect to that God. Now, fortunately, in our society, we have all these other gods, and so the gods of the principality of YouTube is tolerating him and tolerating Brett, even though Brett makes videos that he doesn't like, and tolerating others, even though certain amount of dissatisfaction is being expressed, and not monetizing this video or that video, yada, yada, yada. But again, I can translate this into the language of the gods, and you all will understand me. That's what's happening with these principalities. These are spirits at war.
If 3-4 people, one of whom happens to be in charge of Deutsche Telekom, one of whom happens to be in charge of British Telecom, one of whom happens to be in charge of a global investment bank, one of whom happens to be a successful entrepreneur who just is looking for something to do, and they're hanging out at a dinner table in Aspen, and they just start shooting the shit. They don't have a lot to talk about because there's only certain things that they actually do, which is business and politics, but mostly business.
Which is talk and sit and eat.
So they start talking about business, and it turns out that there's an opportunity for Deutsche Telekom and British Telecom to sell their mobile divisions into a new company that the bank will fund and this guy will run. You'd be surprised how rapidly that gets surfaced and identified as a thing to do. Now, growing up in the Texas Hill Country, I wasn't having those kinds of conversations, and I think most people don't. So that's an example. Right? That's an artifact that emerges out of the notion of the Blue Church, that once you have a vertical hierarchy, and then by definition you have a finite amount of time, you get clusters of these people who are hanging together. And then, by the way, a lot of that human complexity creeps back in. They start having clubs, cliques. They start caring about each other. And they also start getting a lot of groupthink. That good opinion starts to really solidify, and they become blind to what's not within that good opinion. There's very good reasons to believe that the Blue Church is done, meaning that it's in the senescence stage. And senescence has a characteristic where when you move into the senescence stage, you tend to go downhill pretty quickly. So I'm expecting to see the Blue Church sort of increasingly obviously failing, and increasingly obviously losing the habitual or unconscious or unspoken position of being authoritative and being just reality. Right? More and more people are going to be going, that's a thing. That's not the whole thing. It's a thing, and it's kind of doing something, and maybe parts of it are still good, but it's not the whole thing. And it seems to be increasingly fucked up.
Now, what's interesting about these principalities, and you can, again, see this in terms of naming, Jesus, when he casts out legion, what is your name? Namings are from above. Emergence below. Okay, we've got above and below. What is your name? Now that we have the blue church, we have a degree of authority and power over it. Principalities, for the most part, work best unseen. Once they are named, well, what is the naming? Naming comes from above. It shines in from above. Now we see it. Now we see the blue church. Now we can see, once we see the emperor, we can see that the emperor has no clothes. But before we couldn't see it. It just was the way it is. It was just the reality of the situation. It was just the truth. We imagined that we were seeing directly upon the world, but now we see the blue church for what it is. Well, we see it because, let's imagine that we see a young woman in all of her glory. In some ways, we don't see the young woman. We just see the glory and the spirits take us. But let's imagine we see a woman now. She was once beautiful and glorious, and she's still beautiful and glorious, but she's aged. So now we see the wrinkles. So now we see the toll that the age of decay has taken on her, and she is diminished. And so we're not blinded by the glory. Now we see her. She may still hold value. She may still have power. She may still have all of those things, but she's seen. And it's the gods we don't see. Those are the truly powerful gods.
And in the meantime, looking around going, okay, now what? That's the key. Right now we're in a space. We're in that space between 1918 and 1945. We're in the space between 1077 BC and 800 BC, where there's a gap between a coherent collective intelligence. There's a coherent structure for being able to respond as a whole to.
Now again, you might say, well, these principalities are evil. Not necessarily. There's evil in them. They're also functional. And in some ways, we can't live without them. And this is why secularity is sort of a bright cloud. It's because we can't stand the full force of the sun, because we can't stand. We're still too evil. We're still too mixed. And so we live within these principalities until we are finally released from them. But we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and power. So here we are.
To what's happening. And a new one. Here, there's a gap between a coherent collective intelligence. There's a coherent structure for being able to respond as a whole to what's happening. And a new one. Not an old one, a new one, and they're fading. So we're witnessing that transition. We're in the middle of it. And a lot of the phenomena that we've been experiencing over the past, 15 years or so, are of that sort, starting around 2000-ish. Particularly accelerating. You can explain a lot of the things that happened that seemed very inexplicable, like Brexit and Trump, using this model.
That partly it's about novelty building up behind the blue church and then exploding because it had nowhere to go.
Well, it has to do with gaps in the blue church, so blind spots and actuation gaps. That's one side. So it can't do the things that it thinks it can do, and it doesn't perceive. There's lots of things that can.
And that's part of what Michael Malice is doing. He's pointing out the things it can't do. And I see it when I see this whole group of people who have no plans on getting a vaccination. And it doesn't matter how many billboards. But then I say, I'll tell you what, if you tell people get a shot, you get $50, you'll have these folks standing out in line. Why? Because they are participating in other principalities. And if you say, if you get the vaccine, I'll give you $50, they'll get it. And all their ideas about why they don't want to get it, they all just go right out the why. Because, well, how about the lottery? No, the lottery won't do it. It's $50 right here, right now. You can put just about anything in their arm for $50.
Can't perceive. Kind of willfully, actually. And then on the flip side, the rapid evolutionary development of capacity in what I'm calling the red religion, or the decentralized collective intelligence, just to make it very clear. It's not the red religion, just happens to be an instantiation of a way of solving the problem. So, there's a developmental curve. This idea of rate and state is pretty good here. So, Blue Church state of sense-making, choice-making, and actuation, high. Rate, down. It's getting less effective over time. Decentralized collective intelligence, state, low. Rate, high. Right? So there's going to be a crossover point. And what we see is, on occasion, we'll see a breakthrough where this new thing has reached a point of criticality where its capacities are now good enough to show up as actually effective in the visceral world vis-a-vis the fading legacy.
And so when Jordan Peterson talks about YouTube versus mass media, that's exactly what he's talking about.
And I think now it's actually becoming relatively commonplace to kind of see the struggle between Blue Church normative good opinion and new structures of sense-making and new structures of meaning-making and new structures of how those are beginning to try to cohere into actually sovereign collective intelligences that are able to do the whole thing. But we're a bit of the ways there, for sure. It'll take...
I'm not sure we're as far as he thinks they are. And the reason church comes into this is because church is the instantiated expression of, you've got something on top. It's Peugeot, the piece of the Peugeot Kelly video, it's something that comes around. And once you have that coming around, others can see it. And the lives in the instantiation are what others can evaluate, and they can make choices about participating or not participating.
Certainly single-digit years, and possibly double-digit years for the whole thing to come together to a point where it's transitioned formally.
All right, and he's going to talk about a bunch of other things, so we're going to go on. Okay, now we're going to jump back into the Bari Weiss Jordan Peterson conversation, because what we have in this conversation is two lovers of the Blue Church now feeling the fading of their glory, wanting it back. And so there's surgery, there's makeup, there's wardrobe, there's all of this, and they're longing to get back there. And it's not coming back, because anyone deeply within a realm like this doesn't see it. It's the lenses that you see through. Now, once you start seeing the smudges, you might think, oh, we can wipe the smudges from these lenses. Usually what they wind up doing is scratching them. So, and this is all over this experience, but now I'm going to play two clips from this that are separated, but when I listened to it, the contradictions in them were clear. And it's exactly in these contradictions why the reign of this principality is coming to an end, because the contradictions can't stand.
To write there.
And let's just fast forward that I get to the New York Times, and suffice it to say that, I was never popular. I had already published lots of things. I was known as being a Zionist. I was known for views that put me outside of the, let's say, the cool woke kids table.
What do you mean?
Okay, the principality was already evolving away. It was losing its grip. And of course, also what happens in principalities is that people actually you get fired, you're asked to leave, we bring in all these people. That's what happens in a corporation. And now, again, I've been in church work, in other work. So in the 80s and 90s, when churches decided that they wanted to use business means in order to do church better, it's like, well, there's a little bit of principality smuggling going on there. And so churches have all these mission statements, and we're going to management by objective, and it never really worked very well in church. So then so here's our objective, and now we're going to hire according to this. And what I'd often find was, you take all of this time, you spend money on consultants and bring people in, and we're going to discern, and we're going to write this down, and it's going to get real clear, and this is going to be the objective, and these are the criteria that we're going to hire from. You want to know what criteria they hired from? Mostly from the culture that was already there, because that was what their intuitions and their guts told them, that this is the kind of person they wanted. And they probably couldn't sit down and use the words to tell you, because again, we're mysteries to ourselves, and we're only 10% above the water line, above the consciousness line. But that it's still governing from down below there.
By you were never popular. That you glossed over that very rapidly.
Sure.
So there's
I commented on this in yesterday's video.
an experience there.
There was a skepticism of me from the beginning, but I mean, it was the New York Times. It's the most important journalistic platform in the world.
Her lobster was feeling it, baby. And yesterday I called her a lesbian. I guess someone sent me someone put in a comment. Basically, she's declined to state she was married to a man for a while, and now she's married to a woman, and she's been with, so whatever.
And so I was more than willing to put up with, getting the cold shoulder from some of my colleagues, because you just can't overstate how powerful that distribution system is.
Principalities are powerful. Much
more so than the Wall Street Journal. And it holds a certain position, I would say, just not beyond America, in the West. And so I was loath to give that up. And I would be willing and was willing to put up.
She wanted the power.
With a lot in order to cling to that position.
Well, how do you think people saw you? Because they assumed, they made a variety of assumptions about you, and that was what was alienating. What is it that you represented or were in their eyes, do you think?
Heresy. Someone who lived like them, went to the same restaurants as them, dated like them, by all metrics, should have agreed with them on every tenet of this new orthodoxy. But I didn't.
Right, so you're worse because of that. See, I just talked to Rima Azar, professor at Mount in psychiatry, to her good for doesn't know what her crime was. She doesn't really know who her accusers were. They suspended her without pay. She's a tenured professor. It's a worse case than the case in New York with Paul Rossi. It's much worse. It's quite stunning. I mean, if you met her, you'd think, really, she's the person
threat?
That all these institutions were hypothetically designed to protect.
Because again, on paper, she's the person, but we're not really functioning or governing by even what's on the paper.
But if you think about it in a way, it makes sense that it's sort of the people at the edges that are more dangerous than the people across the street. Because if what your goal is to reshape, let's say, what it means to be liberal and progressive, which is what this is about, and if your goal
okay, there's war in the heavenlies,
is to sort of remoralize people into that view of the world, then you need to make examples of people and sharpen the boundary of who is in the community of the righteous and the good by making examples of people who don't go along with every part of it. Because, right, the point of the ostracisms and the point of what it sounds like happened to this professor is to say, it's not really about the person. It's about sending a message to everyone watching it, that if you don't fall in line, if you don't conform, if you don't obey, this is what's going to happen to you. And you better believe that is an extraordinarily effective strategy, unbelievably so.
And for Michael Malice, the principality of anarchy works the same way. And this is where you get into, again, I haven't really made a video on it because it's so difficult, talking about the demonic. And so often there's the Satan story of the scriptures. people look at the Antichrist, they look at all these other Bible passages. Look at the temptations. Look at and they're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Look at the temptations and use that to decide what is demonic. So when we talk about spirit possession, what are we talking about? They're being possessed by an archetype. Now, in certain examples, that's very dramatic, let's say. But look at Jesus' temptations. And they actually have a great deal to do with the kinds of things she's talking about here.
So I think what I saw at the New York Times was, I guess the only way to describe it is this kind of ideological succession. And it's not just a story about the New York Times. It's a story about Nature magazine. It's a story about Bloomberg. It's a story about Harvard. It's a story about
In other words, all the principalities have bosses. Hey, read screw tape letters for this kind of thing. I mean, they level up, but they're not like, people with, although they're not like people with flesh on them. Although we are like this to a degree, the way that we have coalitions, we have conspiracies. What is a conspiracy but a principality, really? Because it's the accumulation of these 4 or 5 people, and it's the intersection of them. Well, there might not be any intersection physically. We're not going to go there with our imagination. There might be some of that too, though. But it's their spirits are intermingled, and their spirits, in fact, come together and birth a new principality. So the leaders of these telecoms and the investment banker and the entrepreneur that all of them like and think has a good reputation, and he could do a company. Let's roll our assets into this guy, and we will birth a new spirit.
Name the institution. It's probably about that institution. And so what's maddening for someone who's seeing it is that
now we're seeing the principality, or at least part of it.
For most people on the outside, they're just saying, wait, it's the New York Times. It has this vested authority. It has the same font. It has the same masthead.
They're the true believers of the Blue Church.
And you're telling me that really the New York Times is no longer the New York Times. And that's exactly what I'm telling you.
What is the New York Times?
And it's...
Yeah, and so then the question is, what is it?
Well, it's... Well, what it
emergence. We're waiting for revelation.
Used to be, it basically is... If the old version of the New York Times...
Watch how she looks up for revelation there. She's looking up. She's looking for revelation. I think this is built into us.
Was... Well, what it used to be, it basically is... If the old version of the New York Times was supposed to be, telling the truth without fear or favor.
Back to, it's just the truth. Well, that was the church that you really believed in. That was your element of true belief.
Now it's something more like MSNBC in print, right?
Okay, now we've got the epistemological storm and the principalities coming down and losing their glory to the degree that we can see the wrinkles and see that the dress is tattering, and we're no longer blinded by the glory. Now we say, oh, yeah, she used to be something. That old gray lady, New York Times.
Right? If you look at Fox or you look at MSNBC, it's very easy to see what those things are. They're political heroin for their side. That's increasingly what the New York Times is. And
she only sees them that way because she's not part of that church.
You can really point, you don't have to believe in an ideological conspiracy to understand the push for that to be the new product, right? Go back to the age before the internet, when the group that the New York Times had to appease were the advertisers. That was who you had to fear pissing off. Well, now that advertising's basically a dead letter, Who do you have to appeal to?
Advertising has moved on to Google and Facebook. Just check out how much advertising is controlled by Google and Facebook. And here we are participating in the Principalities. Wait, let me pause talking. Maybe Google will insert an ad right here.
You have to appeal to your subscribers. Those are the people that are paying the bills in the end of the day. And lo and behold,
and as they'll talk about later, well, this is an issue for Substack, for YouTube, for Patreon. This is appealing to the base. This is, what Donald Trump did throughout his presidency. He appealed to his base. He was following the new paradigm.
Basically a dead letter. Who do you have to appeal to? Well, you have to appeal to your subscribers. Those are the people that are paying the bills in the end of the day. And lo and behold, 95%, it might be 92%, but it's something along those lines, of New York Times subscribers identify as liberals, progressives, or Democrats. So you better believe that in order to keep your
even their appeal to those words is part of it.
Subscribers, your readers, the people paying the bills happy, you have to give them what they want. And so we just shouldn't be surprised anymore that Fox is doing
mooks and knights
what it's doing and that the New York Times is doing what it's doing. It's very good for business. It may not be good for democracy, but it's extremely good for business.
Okay, well, I thought at the height of modernity, business and democracy and God, this was just all one big happy family. And part of the critique of Peterson from David Fuller and Jonathan Rowson is, too much capitalism and not enough critiquing capitalism. And, well, we're all pro-business until the recession, and then we're pro-bailouts. I mean, the part of the problem with this is we just keep setting ourselves up for many of these things.
And I think that the only reason that it's been
But why
harder...
did it work before? Like if this is necessary to appease your consumer base, for example, I mean, you made a bit of a case there that it was...
Why did it work before? Now suddenly we have sort of steady state scientism that we imagine that, or we're always sort of in the same environment, aren't we? That's sort of the deceit of the monarchical vision, that it's always the same, isn't it? No, it's never the same. Because now feels like bright sunlight and seeing things directly and interacting with the world as it is. You didn't see the story you were embedded in because you were so thoroughly part of that story.
It was the advertisers, and you said that the advertisers in some sense now have been replaced by the direct consumer, and they're more arbitrary. But it still begs the question, if the New York Times was a reasonable paper of record 20 years ago, or Time magazine for that matter. It's quite shocking to look at a Time magazine from the 1970s. It's about a quarter of an inch thick and it's all text, it's a real magazine, and that's of course gone by the wayside. But
look at advertising from the year 1910. Used to go into a Wendy's hamburger thing, and they had all these old ads, and they were sitting there describing the products that they were selling. Now it's just images, young, happy. Some of the shows that I'm watching now are, you have these little interstitial ads, and you see the same ad again and again and again and again. That's probably what I'm subjecting those of you who don't have YouTube Premium. I'm subjecting you to that. Or again, you can watch this on Odyssey. You can listen to the podcast. There are no ads in the Odyssey version or the podcast version. So, but advertising is a part of this same thing too. It's part of the principality.
Why did it work before? Why was there a market for, let's call it objective journalism 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and there isn't now?
Well, social media has a tremendous amount to do with it.
Maybe the people are different. Oh, I thought the environment would stay the same. Oh, I thought the people would stay the same. Oh, we're all part of this same product that is swirling around.
10 years ago, and there isn't now.
Well, social media has a tremendous amount to do with it. I mean, because there's no longer what Martin Gurri has called like secret knowledge. And for those who haven't read his book, The Revolt of the Public, it is the best description of everything that we are talking about. You no longer need Walter.
Secret knowledge. Now notice how the same elements have come up in the anarchist video, in the Michael Malice video, in the David Fuller video, the New York Times, Walter Cronkite, social media. So, well, I thought social media was the answer, and now it's the evil.
Cronkite, or of everything that we are talking about. You no longer need Walter Cronkite or the New York Times, for that matter, to tell you about the anti-Semitic attack that happened in West Hollywood the other night, because, by the way, they're probably not going to cover it. All you need to do is follow the right accounts on Twitter. And so when information becomes...
Oh, but Twitter, that's also a corporation. That's also that's also a principality.
Democratized. And you don't rely... Let's put to the side, for example, the Times' excellent China coverage or its foreign policy coverage, where you really do need an enormous budget and people flying to the other side of the world, oftentimes infiltrating closed societies to tell you what is genuinely closed information.
But wait a minute, this is where things get dicey. We're all lost. We're all surrounded by the nuance via Twitter of what's happening in America, and we can get the facts and the news filtered by our filters. How many layers of filters? But in China, they can go and tell us the truth. Wouldn't the situation in China be just as complex as the one here? Wouldn't the filters that we are looking at China through also be choosing and distorting, especially if we don't speak Chinese and we don't know the culture, and we're in the middle of this. Now pay attention here that she's making the case that, well, in order to colonize a certain political base, the New York Times has to adopt a morality and filter by that morality and filter by that narrative and manipulate icons and try to create icons. And, ancient medieval churches looked for icons so that they could attract, that they could have power to have those icons. Well, the 1619 Project is an attempt at creating an icon, isn't it? And if you get an article, the Washington Post with the reporters who broke Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein, become icons. Their names become remembered, and then the paper. It's the medieval church. Here we are doing it again. We'd say this is the same as the 1619 Project is the same as the fingernails of St. Cuthbert. I'd say those two worlds don't connect. Really? They don't? See, now we want to pay attention here, because the New York Times used to be about truth, and it grew a morality and forced that morality in its staff, and I was its victim, and I had to leave. And the reason the New York Times grew a morality was because of this democracy and this market-based system, and that's why this worked.
But for by and large, let's say on domestic issues and a number of, and certainly style and opinion, you can just get that on the internet. And so what am I subscribing? What is the reason to pay for the New York Times? Well, the reason for that has changed. It's no longer so that you can find out what happened in West LA the other night. Increasingly, first of all, it's products like crosswords and cooking.
Now, what's so interesting, and I've played part of this video already, she completely reverses this when she gets into her Substack. when people say, where should I get my news? Well, you should go to Twitter and you should go to Substack and you should follow these people. Now, on one hand, she's saying New York Times has lost itself and has been corrupted by appealing to the base, filthy lucre and democracy and all of those forces. But she's trying to rebuild the blue church on the other end.
And documentaries and all these other things that are more like entertainment. But it's also to rah for your team. That's another enormous reason for it. And I'll just add one more thing about Twitter. You cannot overstate the effect that social media has on editors and reporters.
Ooh, another principality at play in our constellation of the gods.
They are people like anyone else. And very well, Jordan.
They are people like anyone else. They have a consciousness Congress. They have stuff going on inside of them.
Jordan, as I do, how bad it feels to get dragged and slandered on social media by
no one wants to be bottom lobster.
Often, thousands of people. And if you know that in advance, and you know that writing about a certain topic, or writing about a topic that's ugly, or writing about a topic that has a perspective that the majority of your followers or the subscribers to your paper don't agree with, it's like you don't need to be told don't write about it. You tuck yourself out of it because you don't want to experience that punishment. Why is it worth it? Why should I die on that hill? It's easier to commission the 5,000th op-ed about why Donald Trump is horrendous. And so every incentive just pushes you in that direction. The social incentive, both social online, but social in your real life, and the economic incentive. And frankly, the incentive of the people that you're literally surrounded by. And so resisting all of those forces is extremely difficult. The only way that it becomes,
Are ourselves really buffered? The buffered self is a part of the secular age, right? No, she's just deconstruct. There's no buffered self. You are prone to these principalities. Now you engage sort of this imaginative world of spirits up there, and you imagine them in a certain way, but those spirits are up there, and I'm an autonomous individual down here who makes my own decisions. The principalities are all over you. They're inside you. They're possessing you. They're moving you. They're shaping you. And then you have to ask, what kind of other spirit can resist them? Oh, gosh, now Paul, you're just setting up your own softballs to hit. Yeah. It's the way I see it.
Possible is if you know that the people who are running the paper and the people that are in charge and the people who are in the end of the day writing your paycheck believe in that mission that goes against those incentives and supports you. And once that falls away, and once you see, as I did, that you could no longer rely on those people to support and sort of defend you, including against other colleagues at the paper, then you just knew that you weren't going to be protected anymore.
We're permeable. These spirits are all over the place. Systems have spirits. Those spirits colonize us individually and as a group. They limit the menu of options. Remember Jordan Hall with his 6 buttons. Morality in some ways that which justifies limitations of actions up into and including violence. That's what morality really is. Now, fortunately, again, in many ways, we're not at that physical level, but there's war in the heavens. And the gods are fighting, and it's very, they're fighting over the principality that is New York Times. It's, again, imaginatively, it's hard to construct this in our minds, but it's almost like there's this gray lady that is the New York Times, and other spirits are coming in to inhabit her. And Bari Weiss says, the old spirit has been exorcised and driven out, and there's a new spirit, and I had to get out. I couldn't be a part of that spirit. And, part of the spirit is they're appealing to their bases. And now, in all fairness to her and Peterson, they'll talk about this temptation, and they're right. But the question is, where can I find a spirit? Because I need the spirit of truth. I need the spirit that dominates and masters, that can exorcise these other spirits from me. Now, again, what's amazing about this conversation is it's only about one thing.
Tell me, what happened when you decided to leave the Times?
Well,
I mean, how did you come to, I'd like the story. How did you come to that decision?
Well, there was a kind of forced ideological conformity that was happening. And
that wasn't there before. It's the definition of the Blue Church. There was always a forced ideological conformity. So in that way, Michael Malice is right. But in another way, no, that was what you believed in. It used to be the truth, and it's gone.
And it became like a battle to get any piece through that didn't conform to the narrative. And anything that didn't.
And how would that battle manifest itself? So you would commission a story?
In all kinds of ways, yeah. I mean, it would be, I'd like to do a column on this, and me being tremendously, like having to jump through hoops. And
why would you like to do a column on that? Where does that come from?
Get 10 tremendously, like having to jump through hoops and get 10 more sources, whereas other pieces from other writers would just sail through with like obvious embarrassing errors. Not that I haven't had my own share of errors. I have, and they're horrifically embarrassing, and anyone can find them online. But I'm saying, if you didn't comport with the orthodoxy, then your character and your work were just unbelievably scrutinized in a way that another person's weren't.
Of course. It's a principality. That's what you can expect. It's like, well, I wouldn't want to go to a church where they would scrutinize my character and my behavior. It's the definition of a church.
When it came to
so the load increased, the effort load.
Yeah, I mean,
increased.
when it came to commissioning things, like I remember Ayan, her CLE, called me the smuggler, because early on when I was there, again in this very brief good period of self-reflection, I was able to get an op-ed that she wrote into the New York Times. And she was like, I can't believe you were able to do that. So there was this brief period in the beginning where the humiliation of getting Trump wrong, I think, led to an opening of the Overton window. But then, for reasons I can't really figure out, it really, really, really just closed again. And it
war in the heavens. Something up there changed, and everything down here was different. You hear that story all the time. It's what the ancients knew. It's what we knew. There's war in the heavens. Well, I don't believe in spirits or any of those things. Okay.
narrowed. But then, for reasons I can't really figure out, it really, really, really just closed again, and it narrowed much more so, like to a sliver in a way. It was much narrower than I would say pre the election. And of course, Trump had a tremendous amount to do with it. If you believed that, you know, and I think a lot of my colleagues genuinely believed this, that Trump was a fundamental threat to America, to the Republic, to minorities, we can go on and on and on. We know the argument, we could read it anywhere else. Then you were morally obligated to defeat that threat.
Okay. Track morality here, because now suddenly the New York Times has morality. It's like, hey, wait a minute. You're saying what's happening with morale? Is morality good or not good in your corporation? Your morality will always be a function of the principalities that have sway over you.
And that meant that anything that flirted with any number of topics where he was on a particular side of it, then the right was the correct position was always to be on the opposite side of it. And so you saw this really, really clearly, let's say in the lab leak theory, right, which was completely of the Wuhan coronavirus, which increasingly it seems like the coronavirus was, unintentionally, let's say, leaked from this lab in Wuhan. Well, that became unsayable, and it became unsayable because people in the Trump administration were saying that was the case, and so everything was seen through the prism of this incredibly singular figure of Trump. So that sped it all up. And then you had the summer and you had the killing of George Floyd. And that just brought every thing that was sort of at a low boil, just absolutely bubbling over. And
Spiritual?
the way that it bubbled over most acutely was in the choice in June to run an op-ed by Republican Senator Tom Cotton that said not that the National Guard should be brought in to quell peaceful protests, but that the National Guard should be brought in to quell violent rioting. It was a controversial piece by any stretch in that really sensitive moment. But it was a view, frankly, that was shared by the majority of Americans, if you go back and look at polls at that time. But inside the context, the rarefied context of the New York Times, not only was this op-ed seen as controversial, it was seen as literal violence. Literal violence. More than 800 of my colleagues signed a letter saying that this op-ed literally put the lives of Black New York Times staffers in danger. And anyone that didn't...
What was the argument?
The funny thing about this word literal. Oh, we don't want Christians being literal.
What kind of argument was made in favor of that position?
That the argument was, first of all, it was a misreading of his op-ed. It was based on a fundamental misreading that
Oh, now we're having a fight about interpretations of texts. Gosh, where have I heard this stuff before?
Insisted that his op-ed was about bringing in the military to put down justified, understandable riots in reaction to George Floyd. So they never made the distinction. They collapsed the distinction between bringing in the National Guard to put down violent rioting and bringing in the National Guard to put down peaceful protests. And then they said, that because police and the military are systemically racist, I'm being crude and just sort of giving you the overview, that this move would necessarily result in an inordinate amount of Black death of Black Americans. So that was the argument. And what happened was not from the top a defense of the op-ed and a defense of all of the various...
Was this an op-ed you had commissioned?
No, I had nothing to do with the op-ed.
Okay.
I ended up...
From the top. What is the top? What is the function of the top? Is the head supposed to tell the body what to do? Yeah. And she's saying the top didn't function as it should have. In other words, there was something else at the top.
You're just watching this.
Yeah, I ended up being sort of brought in as a kind of punching bag because I ended up tweeting out some tweets that I think hold up extremely well about that this was a very, very useful litmus test to understand the generational divide inside the New York Times. But I had nothing to do with the op-ed. But the people that did have something to do with the op-ed, my 25-year-old...
I want to ask you something about
Sure.
that generational divide. Sorry.
It's okay.
Well, I'm still trying to think through this. The education of young people to adopt the viewpoint that our social institutions are fundamentally corrupt and driven by power. So then I think, well, how much of that, this calls for speculation, how much of that is a consequence of the breakdown of family structure? I mean, so I see the positive element of our social institutions as something like the positive aspect of the paternal spirit. So it's a father, it's the positive father who encourages in exactly the way that you encourage the writers that were under your care to express themselves and develop.
Am I the father in that situation?
Well, you would be, you're female, but you're working in the patriarchy. So yes, I would say symbolically speaking, that's a manifestation of, well, the spirit of your Jewish ancestors. Let's put it that way. Well, I mean that. And you're the one who said that tradition has shaped you to such a degree. It's like, well, you feel you have an obligation to embody that. Well, is it not a paternal spirit? That's the tradition.
And is morality not built into that?
And but what if you've never experienced that?
I don't know if I would call it paternal or not. That's not the way I think about things. But I do think I don't know
if your family's broken, if you've never had a positive relationship with someone who's...
I think it's different than that. I think it's about should corporations, which is what the New York Times is in the end of the day.
Okay. What is the New York Times in the end of the day? It's a corporation. What on earth does that word mean? Why is corp? You know, we just heard Jordan Peterson say young people wouldn't recognize the corpse of mass media. That's a corporation. It's the oration of a corpus. It's a spirit. It's a distributed person. It's Santa Claus. It's Uncle Sam. It's all of these things. It's incarnated in a newspaper and a building and employees and departments and reporters and all of these things. It's what it is.
Should they be moral actors? That's the big difference.
Why did you go into journalism? You wanted to be a moral actor. They can't help but be moral actors. Now, at what level should certain aspects of morality function within the corporation? You want to up the resolution and ask that. You don't want them to be amoral. In that sense, the Chinese government is a corporation. The American government is a corporation. We don't call them corporations, but this embodied principality is in fact what they are. But again, as we saw, they're multi-layered themselves, and they're morphing and changing and moving. And you've got giant ones like Blue Church, which is, instantiated in other corporations, which are sub-instantiations all the way up.
Difference. Like should they be moral actors? That's the big difference. Like there's a sense among the younger generation that a newspaper or a tech company or whatever the place that you work should somehow also not just be about pursuing the bottom line, but should also be a manifestation.
She just complained about the corruption of the New York Times being because it was pursuing the bottom line, and therefore it engaged in a purification thing to appeal to one particular base. She just said that. I just played that. Connect the dots, please.
Of whatever the place that you work should somehow also not just be about pursuing the bottom line, but should also be a manifestation of what you consider to be good politics and good morals.
The New York Times lost its way because they pursued the bottom line. And now she flips 100% and says, no, they should be pursuing the bottom line. That's what led to the corruption of the New York Times, in your view. And we all make these mistakes. I don't want to push this too hard, but my point is, they're gonna play in the values moral realm too. The question is how, at what level, to what degree, when and where.
And that's why you see, I don't know if you followed this entire story at Coinbase that I think is really, really interesting, where basically the heads of Coinbase said, because they felt like rather than pursuing excellence for the company, so much of employees' energy and attention and time was being devoted to, using Slack to discuss the politics of the day. And they basically said, look, no more politics at work. Work is not a place for politics. Work is a place for making Coinbase excellent. And if you're uncomfortable with that, we're going to give you a really, really nice severance package. You've seen Basecamp follow suit. You've seen, and I suspect that we're going to see.
When did this happen?
This happened, I would say Coinbase in the past 2 months, and then Basecamp, another company, much more recently.
But now, again, crypto and Elon Musk and, Coinbase deals in crypto, and crypto is killing the environment and it's also killing the chance to get a really decent graphics card that you can buy and put in a PC you make yourself. So none of this stuff is going to be as easily dispensed with from in this perspective. Now, principalities are exposed. Does that mean that facts don't matter? No. In fact, they matter because spirits move matter. And all of this is one system, and it's It's heaven and earth. We're not getting beyond the two worlds mythology.
So if we take this intuitive approach and then some sort of pragmatism and some sort of multi-factor, we still run
multi-factor because we have to be watching all of this because it's all connected and working through
into the reality that people have different intuitions or different orientations, symbolic systems that they operate within. And there's not necessarily there's conflict there is what it feels like, right?
Yeah.
And one reaction to that is sort of, I think, the Vervaeke response, which is let's step outside of the narratives and treat them as instrumental rather than existing within them, right? And then we can have the religion that is not a religion. And then we don't have to deal with the fact that the Islamic description, the Muslim description of Christ is not congruent with the Christian description of Christ, right? Like he's respected there, but the meaning of what he did isn't possible to glean from the description that they give. And so there's inherently a potential for conflict. And I don't know if that's the same in Buddhism and Taoism versus Christianity. I tend to think that they're more potentially congruent, but whatever, there are going to be places where that's not, where the two systems are going to be in conflict, right? And how do we navigate those waters without a clearer epistemology?
Sorry, you broke down. How do we navigate those waters?
Without a clearer epistemology.
Yeah. So obviously, okay, so there are many things to say. One is that we can only perceive the pure pattern from an embodied place.
You can only perceive the principality at work in a corporation from what it's doing on the ground. There's an intuitive element where you're feeling it, but do facts not matter? No, facts do matter. It's that facts are always within and subject to principalities. And you only can see the principalities at work via the facts. But again, we've got data, narrative, and icon, and we're using the narrative not only we're filtering the facts with narrative, but then we're also developing the narrative from the facts. So it's back and forth. And we need each other.
And to pretend that you can, or to pretend that you are leaving that, is to delude yourself. This is what I think. And so I think that the position, or the universalist position, of saying, I'm going to step outside of these narratives in order to be able to see them all is a delusion. It's still.
Now that frustrates you because I just read, well, Paul always sees things from his point of view. What other point of view do I have to work with? Oh, you should step outside. There's no outside. We are what we are. We are limited. And again, I'm going to play my conversation with Paul and Leitner either Friday morning or Monday morning. I haven't decided which yet. But we are what we are. And there's no getting around that. We have to track it from an embodied place. We can only know the wind by watching the leaves on the tree move.
The position, or the universalist position, of saying, I'm going to step outside of these narratives in order to be able to see them all is a delusion. It's still a narrative. It's just that you don't see it. It's the narrative of the Tower of Babel. It's the narrative of, and it doesn't. And what it leads to is it actually will lead to fragmentation. It'll lead to a breakdown. The desire to it'll lead to not having a real common narrative. And so therefore it'll be like a competition. That's where it's going to be even more so a competition of narratives, because you have to embody something. Like you have to be in a path. Like you have to be on a road going somewhere. And if you say like, I'm going to stand above all these roads and I'm going to say, well, actually, I noticed that all these roads lead to the same place, but you're not doing it. You're not actually doing it. So that's
you are within the realm of the warfare that's happening, and the best you can do is appeal to a principality, appeal to the one who conquered the principalities. And that's where you appeal to a spirit to drive out the other spirits. Now, will I get that wrong? Yes. Do I embody that spirit perfectly? No. But what other chance do you have?
one thing. Like that's one thing in terms of that problem is I think that the idea of saying that someone is going to not engage or kind of rise above it's similar to Brett Weinstein when he says, it's similar to Sam Harris or Brett Weinstein when they say something like, don't you see, like when Brett Weinstein just says, don't you see that this is obviously moral? And you're like, what? You don't see your own story. Like you always are in a story.
And you're always dealing in a moral universe. Coinbase says, well, we're not going to talk about any. Coinbase is about Coinbase. Well, I thought you're destroying the world by encouraging people to mine Bitcoin, yada, yada, yada. I thought this is a morality-free zone. That's what you want from your corporations? That's what you want from your governments?
To me, it's just inevitable. Unless you're like in the mystical vision. Like once you, like if you enter into a mystical vision and you enter into, let's say, kind of this moment of pure transcendence where you're completely united with God, and you're completely united with the infinite in every way, then yes. But then when you talk about it, when you come back down, you now have to give it flesh and body and story. It has to retake body and flesh for it to exist.
So where I get really caught in this,
Okay, what Peugeot said right there, just to pause that, people, the mystical. Okay, tell me about the mystical. I can't. The reason that you can't is the reason that it's of limited utility. I didn't say it's worthless. I said it's of limited utility because it has to come back down. And now we're going to get into, well, the intuitive approach. Well, it's all up there. Well, ontology has to be addressed with epistemology. And that's why I don't like objectivity and subjectivity. I'd rather talk about physicality and spirituality. And that's such a fudgy word, but I don't have a better word right now. It's the wind that moves the trees. It's the principality that is exercised and displaced by another within another principality, which is the New York Times. And you and I can't view the physical without a spiritual lens, but we can't know the spiritual without seeing it physically manifest in the world. That's what we see the physical with the spiritual, and we see the spiritual by the physical. And there's no escaping this for how and who we are right here and right now.
All these discussions.
Story, it has come back down. Yes. But then when you talk about it, when you come back down, you now have to give it flesh and body and story. It has to retake body and flesh for it to exist.
So where I get really caught in all these discussions is it comes back to scientific epistemology works and delivers truth in a certain way, but it doesn't deliver all the truths that we need, right? But if we adopt any other system that collapses that, then it's really a problem, right? So we have to do that. And where I get hung up is, like, I've said that I think I'm a non-theistic Christian, and the I think part is a really important qualifier. and I can go a little deeper there, but when I listen to a lot of Christians describe their relationship to the resurrection, what I hear them doing is trying to operate a logical, coherent system that looks something like science, where they're making all of these exceptions to how they would treat a actual scientific question. Right?
Now, I'll be fair to people who do this. They are trying to map something into modernity. And I think it is also of limited utility.
Right? And so
in
what
terms
I tend
of the
to
resurrection of Christ, you mean?
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
What I tend to think is,
That's it, but that's also because, look, I don't deny the sad state of Christianity. Like, I really do not deny that. And I think that Christianity has become, which one of the reasons why it has led to where it is. I think it's part of the bigger story. I've talked about this many times before, but it's nonetheless happening. Like, Christianity is dying, and in part of that has been Christians embracing of a really strange materialism and a kind of scientism as their worldview. And so the idea of understanding the resurrection is, you have to understand the resurrection as something like strong emergence, you could say, like something as a phenomena which actually gives you the key to all phenomena. And so it can't completely act on the same level as the phenomena that it's giving the unity to. And all miracles are like that. Miracles are not just weird, like weird exceptional things that happen. That's never the case. It's not just like something unexplainable happens and that's a miracle. That's not what they are. Miracles are always higher up on the level of pattern. That is, they're actually embodying the pattern of reality at a level beyond the normal, usual levels of causality. And so what it looks like.
Now, what he said is probably really hard to understand for some of you, and I don't know that I can make it clearer, but again, think of the fact that so we've talked about principalities and how principalities reign. Throughout this whole video, we've been talking about principalities and what they are and seeing them and having them exposed. It was a principality that put people on the moon. 100 years ago, what are the kind of thoughts that people would have had about that? Physicality expresses spirit. We only know spirit by physicality. So we're right in that realm. A miracle is a revelation, and it is instantiated. To go from New York to San Francisco in less than 6 hours in 1849 would have been a miracle. Today it is commonplace. Whole realms of principalities have been at work in making that change. Miracles that we see Christ do, including the resurrection, are, as Peugeot said, kind of different order things happening, but they're expressing spirit as well. And the ancients understood that. When the critique of Jesus, he casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub, and Jesus says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Just think through the charge and the response, and you can begin to understand what is happening there. And now the resurrection, again, the resurrection is not just a resuscitation of, let's say, Jesus calling Lazarus out of the tomb, or the EMS using a defibrillator to bring back to life someone who has just recently had a heart attack. The miracle, I'm definitely going to post this before I post my conversation with Paul Anleitner, because I go into that quite a bit more deeply with Paul Anleitner in terms of what the resurrection is. and how that works, and the relationship between crucifixion and resurrection and this world.
It actually looks like it's pulling in the multiplicity into itself in a way that doesn't seem to make sense at the lower level. Yeah. Just like qualities of certain beings, if you try to look at just the lower elements, when you're like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, why is water wet? Oxygen and hydrogen are neither of those, and so how is it that I get to wet? You can't find it there.
It's emergent, right?
It's like but it's a strong emergence because it's more than that. It's not arbitrary, because that looks arbitrary. Like the
right. Part of the faith of the word emergence that people are putting into it is an attempt to get the intentional out of the arbitrary. And that's why Jonathan, the prophet of purpose, says it's not arbitrary. That's what he says again and again and again and again. Now, and this is where I get my point. Let's say, so Rafe and I have spoken a number of times. Let's say I visit Rafe up in Washington, or Rafe visits me down here in Sacramento. And let's say that while we're talking, someone comes into the church and says, Pastor, I've got this problem. Would you pray with me? I say, okay, Rafe, sit here for a minute. I'm going to go and pray with this person. And I go and pray with that person. And let's say something dramatic happens. Like something happens that that someone might be tempted to say, it's a miracle. Now again, people set up all of these ideas about, you can read Greg Keener's 2-volume massive book on miracles and all of those stories. We think that if, let's say, someone came in a wheelchair and said, Pastor Paul, would you pray for me? And then I pray for them, and they walk out pushing the wheelchair instead of being pushed in it. Someone say, oh, that's a miracle. But and you would find all of these other reasons why this wasn't. And that goes back to C.S. Lewis's beginning of his book Miracles, where he said, the only person that I know in my life who has claimed to see a ghost doesn't believe in them. And I want to make a video on the whole UFO phenomenon, because that is another lesson in this. Because seeing is not believing. Because we don't just see. You can't see without interpreting. Every act of seeing is interpretation. It can't help but be that, and that's what those of you for whom this matters, that's what all the new brain science is telling us. And I use the example of my friend whose wife we just had a service for last Saturday. His friend is dead too now. They're both dead. Who had very low vision. And so I would sometimes quietly walk up behind him, and I might be wearing black, and it'd be like I popped into his frame of reference, because scientists will tell you that what your eyes are doing to construct this image of the room that you're in, or the thing that you're sort of imagining you're viewing directly, is really far more complex than that. And the same goes with miracles. And so the reason that I say that the physicality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is true and matters, and matters in terms of how people live. Let's imagine, and at the beginning of the video with Jonathan Peugeot, Rafe has a little promotional piece about his retreats. And let's say Rafe is teaching you how to swing from trees and jump from rocks, and there's a particularly big, scary jump, and Rafe says, it can be done. And the person says, have you ever seen it done? No. Okay. Will you jump it? I've never seen it done. Okay. Can it be done? The physical resurrection of Jesus means, because it happened, it can be done. Now, if you don't believe that, what won't you do? Well, you say, well, I won't try and get up out of my box when they put me in it. No, that's not the point, because again, something has to come from above. And again, I got into this with Paul Anleitner. Something has to come from above, because this world is not able to host certain things on its own. It needs the invasion of another spirit, which is actually the creative spirit that made it. The creator and redeemer are the same, but it needs an invasion in order to achieve the potential possible within it. And that's what the resurrection of Jesus is about. And if you say, well, I won't jump because I can't go there. Well, again, believing in the resurrection isn't about jumping. It's about living your life in such a way that you hold on to it loosely, because you believe that you might not be able to make the jump. He will carry you in that jump. You get these scenes in Lord of the Rings at Khazad-dûm where, or that's at Helm's Deep. Gimli says, "You have to throw me." And at one point, Khazad-dûm, you grab the hobbit and you leap holding the hobbit. Well, that's Christianity. Because Jesus, you say, "It's too far, I can't make it, you have to throw me." Getting thrown by Jesus is a heck of a thing sometimes. So they talk about this, but I just wanted to, if you haven't seen the video, Bridging the Mythological and Scientific Worldviews with Jonathan Peugeot, that's on Rafe Kelly's Kelley. I was spelling it wrong. It's a great conversation. But it's not something that, see, this again is why I'm a Calvinist, it's not something I can talk you into. It's something he has to throw you over. And you say, well, how's that going to happen? Well, it's going to happen through physical beings and through events in the physical world. But that's because of how spirit and physicality work. So now I'm very aware that, I can't talk you into belief. And by belief, I mean trust and living into and leaping in a way that you've never seen anybody else reach, but you actually do see them reach it. And they do it when they live their lives for love in service of each other. And, the entire, what's amazing about the Michael Malice conversation is that the entire conversation, Michael Malice, just like just about everybody else, Michael Malice's moral yardstick that he uses to complain about the corporations and complain about the government and complain about the university professors and complain about everyone else, the moral yardstick was given to him from Jesus. And Tom Holland writes about how that moral yardstick has gone all around. And so all of this, now remember, Satan is the accuser and he points fingers and he's always condemning. And, but all around people are doing that deed while using the moral yardstick of Jesus. So Jesus has colonized. He has defeated the principalities and powers. Now, the New Testament often talks in categories as if we are at the end. Now, in the middle, it looks to us like defeating, but we see the process ongoing, and it always looks at risk. But remember how World War II looked in 1941. So, but what do we need? So, Pastor, give me a little bit of application. And actually, Jeff, who's been on the channel a number of times and runs the Randos channel, sent me this clip and said basically, estuary?
So that's right. And so my dream situation and what I'm trying to build toward is creating that ecosystem. I am not interested in like the creator economy, whatever that, meaning I think I've watched you and I've watched other public figures who have become such potent symbols. And on the one hand, I'm like, look at the effect that they've had. It's so powerful. And I know just from when I was, writing about the intellectual dark web and reading 12 Rules for Life, I remember sitting at a hotel and a young waiter, a man coming up to me saying, like, that book saved my life. And that's unbelievably powerful. And on the other hand, it's the burdens of it seem very scary and dangerous to me. And so I want to place myself ideally in a kind of round table, like a kind of group where it's like a sensibility. And
She wants to swim in an estuary, baby.
Not the only one, because I don't know. Am I wrong about?
No, I don't think you're wrong at all. I mean, in the new book I wrote, Beyond Order, I talk about this necessity for social interaction as a sanity, as the prime sanity maintaining process. Is that sane people aren't sane because they're so organized internally that their psyches are organized properly. That's what you might expect to conclude if you were psychoanalytically minded or maybe psychologically minded. But what really is the case, that what maintains our sanity is constant receptivity to the reactions of other people. At least that's part of what maintains it. We have a dialogue with our own conscience, which is something like that internal spirit that you described earlier, the spirit that animates history speaking within us. We have a responsibility to that, but we have to be open to other people, especially people who don't share our opinions, because we're stupid and lost. And it's absolutely crucial. So I think that from a psychological perspective, I think that's a great idea. And I mean, it also keeps you alive because then...
Well, and so again, what he just said about people, stupid and lost, you say, well, you're a Christian, and yeah, but there's lots of stupidity and lostness in me. There's plenty. And I can learn a lot from a non-theistic Christian. And I can learn a lot from an atheist, and I can learn a lot from an icon carver, and I can learn a lot from a former New York Times opinion columnist, and I can learn a lot from an anarchist, and I can learn a lot from a Canadian psychologist, and I can learn a lot from, but part of what Bari Weiss was getting at was there needs to be a breadth in the pool, but it can't be infinite. That's more the sea, the ocean, the open ocean. But it can't be too narrow. That's to a certain degree the river. Now there's a place for openness and there's a place for narrowness, but human beings sort of thrive in the middle here. So we need a group of not a million fans, that won't do it, but more than one or two. And that's where these Dunbar numbers come into, maybe a group discussion of, on stage maybe 2 or 3, in a round circle maybe 8 to 10, maybe hopping between circles. I need a group with which to swim. And they have to be physically. I mean, they have to be definite people with their own stories. And the stories, it's helpful if the stories have variety, but not too much variety. It's, again, all this opponent processing. You need enough, but not too much. And you need diversity, but not too much diversity. And you need, and it needs to be contextualized. This is part of the reason that churches sort of, stay limited often, and it needs to. Mega churches have to break down into small groups and other things. I mean, that's a function of how we are.
Then other people are feeding you new ideas all the time, right? And
yeah, and I think for all of the downsides of the New York Times, I think being around people, good faith people, and there were many good faith people who just disagreed with me. And like, I had a wonderful editor there who, was definitely to my left, but was such a fair reader and made everything I wrote stronger. Like, I need that.
Yeah,
everybody
definitely
needs that. And one of the things that I think is one of the beauties of this sort of like Cambrian explosion of the podcast world and the newsletter world and the Patreon world and the locals world and the whatever's going to come before we publish this world. It's amazing because we can connect directly to an audience, but also like everyone needs an editor. everyone. And everyone needs a community. And, you know, if your community is only like parroting back to you the things you believe, that's not a recipe for growth. And it's also a recipe, I think, for being captive to who you are in a particular moment. And I really want to make sure that I'm giving myself the ability to change and grow, as hard as that might be able to do in public.
Well, that's the right thing to model, I think, is that I believe that when these podcasts work properly, the reason they're compelling to the degree they manage to be compelling is because what people are observing and participating in is the process by which two people mutually transform one another towards a higher good.
Verveci dialogos.
And they're
Yes.
and so we're both struggling to make things clear and to approach something that we don't have yet. But it's in that struggle that the motivation arises.
But you know how you and I, before this podcast started, both said, like, I said to you, I'm nervous. And you said, I've been nervous for 5 years or anxious for 5 years. And I said, I know exactly what you mean. Like, that's true to some extent. But we both know that we're having this conversation, just the two of us right now, but that it's going to be in public and that millions of people potentially could see it.
Yeah, and you're going to look at the camera and I'm going to call it out.
And that ultimately changes the way that we talk to each other. It makes us more careful. And I think that's a good thing. But the conversation...
And more nervous.
And more nervous. But the conversation
Rightly
you
so.
and I might have in private, like, that's a different conversation. And that to me is the most precious kind.
It can't be too different, but it has to be different enough, but the same enough too. And you know, she's exactly right. And that's why, you know, we can do some things on Discord and online and on my YouTube channel and on Zoom. We can do some things that way, but other things we're going to have to be local. And it's going to have to be instantiated. And it's going to have to take on physicality. And it's going to take physicality probably of a building. And it's going to take principality probably of an organization. And there's going to have to be a degree of narrowness so it can be productive, and a degree of breadth so it can also be productive. And it's going to take on all of those things. And, you know, this is part of the reason why church is what it is in all of its glory and all of its tragedy. And it's part of the reason why, you know, Peugeot and I, when people come to us and, well, you're going to have to church somehow. Now, in a lot of places, there are churches around that you can church with, but you might have trouble finding a church. So then you're going to have to figure out, well, how can I church with others? And how can we do it together? Because you need enough authority structure, and you're going to need to deal with all of these layers. You have to deal with the principality layer and then all the nested principalities. You're going to have to deal with it coming through physicality, and you're going to have to deal with the other people that have all of this inside of them. You're going to have to do all of this, but you're going to have to do it. You can't just listen. You've got to talk. You've got to give. You've got to commit. You've got to lean. You've got to jump. You've got to act. And it's in all of this where we actually begin to move forward. Cooperation is not tyranny. Cooperation is essential. It's to be human is to submit. You have to submit to something. And in fact, you submit to many things at many different layers. And you can't live any other way. We are sub-rulers. We are viceroys. We are middle managers of creation below the creator, below these principalities and powers that he leads in triumphal procession. But the question is, what are you going to submit to? And now you might say, well, my agency is critically compromised in many ways. Yes, it is. But to the degree that you have choice and can express will and can express volition and can express agency, find the highest thing to commit to and pursue it. I guess you could call that an altar call. So I don't know how long this was. Hopefully I won't make the same mistake I made in the video that I released Tuesday where I didn't get the whole thing in. But thanks for watching. Leave a comment. Thank you for your time and attention.